Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. And thank you, Innovation Works and Larry for having us here. We are going to spend the next 30, 40 minutes or so talking about ways to maximize your granting potential through non-dilutive sources of funding. We'll talk about the NIH, the DoD, BARDA, and some other sources of funding. And I'll start by saying that if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A box. And of course, we'll give you the slide and there'll be a link to this webinar. So I'll start by saying that I am a part of the FreeMind group. We have been doing this for about 20 years now. We help organizations win grants, government contracts. We have about 100 people work with academia, work with industry, submit about 600 grants and government contracts every year on behalf of our client base, and help them win about $150 million in awards. And when I say non-dilutive funding, and if we talk about the funding landscape, we typically target about $50 billion that are allocated annually. Most of it comes from within the NIH, which is the National Institute of Health. And when we say NIH, we basically talk about 27 institutes and centers that are divided according to indication, populations, and technology. So just to name a few, we have the National Cancer Institute, the largest institute within the NIH. We have the National Institute of Diabetes, Digestive and Kidney Diseases, National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, National Institute of Bioimaging and Bioengineering, National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, National Eye Institute, National Institute of Aging, and the National Institute of Mental Health. Obviously, these are all just examples of the main ones. But we also talk about other HSS organizations such as BARDA, the FDA, and the CDC. We also include the National Science Foundation that allocates a few great ways to win these grants, mostly through SBIR type awards. We'll talk about the Department of Defense, that includes the US Army, DARPA, DTRA, and the CDMRP. And of course, some private foundations as well, such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Michael J. Fox Foundation and JDRF. And the reason we are so focused on these types of grants is that we see that historically, 50% of all FDA-approved drugs receive government funding at some point during the course of their R&D activities. And getting these grants is a very strong indication to the FDA, to investors, which are the projects that will hopefully be able to see the full potential of the healthcare benefits that they offer. And in addition to getting money, which is obviously great when it's non-dilutive, we do see that for every dollar you win through these public sources of funding, you are likely to get $8.38 from the private sector in the future, more specifically over the course of the next 8 years or so. So getting government grants is not just about the dollar, it's about getting the validation of the funding agencies, and that goes a very long way. When we look at the US government's motivation to invest in companies, we do see, and obviously everything is, I'm quoting here is from the Milken Institute paper that was published in 2012. We do see that the US government has an ROI, return on investment, of $2.3 for every dollar they give away through these grants. So we do see that it's a win-win for all. When we look at the funding landscape and the types of projects that these sources fund, we do see that they are available throughout the course of the R&D, everything from discovery all the way up to phase 3 clinical trials. And when we look at everything out there, we tend to divide these grants into 3 major groups. So for early stage work, very little preliminary data, if any at all, we're talking about around $200,000 to $500,000 per grant. More advanced stages, still preclinical or early stage clinical, typically $500,000 to about 3 or 3.5 even. And when we're talking about advanced projects, big trials, the sky's definitely the limit. And when I say the sky's the limit, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars per grant if we're able to justify the work, of course. So before we start, I wanted to start with some case studies, just to show you that companies can actually use these grants and leverage these grants to make sure that the company stays afloat. And I picked two companies that we worked with. The first one is NanoMR, a company from Albuquerque. They raised a Series A, 5.5 million, not bad at all. Started working and raised a Series B, 13 million. And as I'm sure you all know, doing medical work is very expensive, and they basically ran out of money. At that point, they decided to submit a BARDA contract, and we'll talk about that some more. So the way the review process works with BARDA is you start by submitting a very short summary and hopefully get invited to submit the full application. So they submitted the short summary and got good feedback. And at that point, they contacted us and said, hey, we really need to win this grant or we will not have a company. And we said, sure, no pressure. And ended up helping, and I'm happy to say that they won a $21 million grant from BARDA. Using that grant, they had some more runway and were able to continue on with their work. They they made a deal with DNAE and they were bought. And they were just able to use that grant, win another BARDA grant, and continue on from there. Another company that I want to mention here is a company called Cubist, not a small company at all. When they approached us, it was just after they acquired two companies called Trius and Optimer. They were both awarded through these funding sources, and that's how the management team at Cubist found out that these are actually grants that could be used to fund work. They started working with us, submitted quite a few grants, were awarded by the NIH, and at some point they were acquired by Merck. So I'm not saying win NIH grants and you'll be acquired by Merck, but obviously it will not be a bad step towards that. So when we look at the NIH's budget, and this is the budget for 2020, you can see that out of the $41 billion that the NIH has, most of it goes out to fund medical research and projects, either extramural or internal projects. And the budget that actually went out to fund research this year was $35 billion. And I'm actually excluding from that number the fact that they also got almost $6 billion to fight COVID-19. And as you can see, you know, most of the money they have is actually out there to fund work. So if we look at the categorical spending of the NIH, we can see that most of it goes out to fund oncology work, neurodegeneration, and neurodegenerative diseases, and about 44 billion for infectious diseases. And yes, again, this does not include the COVID-19 related money that they got. And honestly, I'll tell you, I am going to leave out anything Corona during this talk, because as I'm sure you understand, this is very, very out of the ordinary for these funding agencies. And if we're talking about how they work, obviously that's not something that is relevant, unfortunately. So this is what we see with the NIH. As you can see, many indications, and these are, by the way, just the main ones. I can say that the take-home message here is that any type of R&D project that you can come up with will probably be funded by the NIH. So how do you find all of these amazing sources? This is the NIH search engine. If you were to go there, and you can see the link on the bottom left corner of the screen, and look up active funding opportunities, you'll see that we have almost 1,500 opportunities that are open now. Obviously, you need to be able to find the best ones for you, and in a way, that's a very important element of submitting these grants. You need to know what you have and what is out there, and make sure that you're submitting to the most appropriate mechanism for you. So here, I would like to talk about different grants, but I also want to mention that there are a few submission types, and we tend to divide those into three. The first one is solicited opportunities that address specific topics of interest. These are grants that you would probably imagine to see. Please help us fight liver cancer, for example, and they have a very specific topic, a very specific mission, and are a bit more intuitive. The second type is the unsolicited applications, or the investigator-initiated opportunities. These include mostly the R21, the R1, and the SBR-STTR programs. I will say that even if you'll go through the search engine and you'll see all of these hits, you'll see the parent announcements, and we'll talk about them in a minute. I will say that most of the money allocated by the NIH goes out through these types of opportunities, the investigator-initiated opportunities. And the rationale behind it is to not box you into something they thought of before, and really give you the opportunity to pitch your idea to the NIH, which is obviously very helpful, because we are talking about projects that are new and innovative. The last type of funding round is the broad agency announcements, or BAAs. These are the large-scale solicitations, typically address a wider area of research. We can see them with the NIH. We see that most of the work done through the DoD and BARDA is through BAAs. Typically, we do see that they fund late-stage work, so not so much preclinical work. So let's dive in. So we'll start with the NIH, and we'll start with the SBIR initiative. When we talk about SBIRs, we see that we have two phases in a way. The phase one is up to $250,000, and the phase two is up to almost 1.7 million. They do divide it into non-clinical and clinical type of submission, so make sure that you're submitting the right one. But in terms of the amounts, they are the same. I will also point out that they just increased these amounts about a year ago, after a very long time where they had it at 225 for the phase one and 1.5 million for the phase two. We're not sure how they came up with these beautiful round numbers, but as long as it's more than what they had before, obviously no complaints here. Make sure that you're looking into the solicitation and making sure that you're submitting the right one. When we're talking about SBIRs, we're talking about grants that support small businesses, unlike the STTR that supports work done as a collaboration between an industry and an academic partners. Here as well, we see that they have non-clinical and clinical type of funding, and again with the phase one and phase two for both. So one important element of the SBR STTR grants is that they have a lot of stipulations. So the first one and the most important one to say is that these are grants for domestic small businesses. We talked about the different mechanisms. We talked about phase 1 and the phase 2, and in addition to those, there are ways to group the two. So firstly, you have the fast track, which is essentially a phase 1 and a phase 2. When you're thinking about submitting a fast track, the most important element to bear in mind is, will you be able to justify such an elaborate project? Typically, what you'll see within a fast track application is a very clear list of criteria determining whether or not you've completed the phase 1 and are able to move to the phase 2. In a way, it's easier because the applications are shorter and you don't have to wait until you're done with the phase 1 and then submit the phase 2. But obviously, it is a slightly risky mechanism. So make sure that you either talk to the program officer or make sure that you're very confident in the work that you're proposing. Another route is a direct to phase 2 route, and that is for projects that have completed a phase 1 equivalent body of evidence and are able to continue on to the phase 2. The direct to phase 2 was actually closed for many years, and they reissued it a couple years ago, and we were obviously very happy. But again, this is where you make sure that they feel confident with the amount of data that you can show them and the progress that you've made. In terms of eligibility, this is for small U.S. businesses under 500 employees. The business itself, the company itself, needs to be mostly owned by U.S. citizens or U.S. residents, and the work needs to be done in the U.S. The goal of these initiatives is to make sure that we have industry collaborations, that we're able to put people to work, and everything needs to be done within the U.S. When we're talking about STTR and SBIR, both of them are under these regulations. The program is a little under 4% of any agency's budget by law. So in a way, we aren't talking about a fixed portion of the pie, but we're talking about a very, very large pie. So some more information. The deadlines for the SBIR STTR programs are January 5th, April 5th, and September 5th. The restrictions for the SBIR are that for a phase 1, typically 2/3 of the award needs to be allocated to the company itself or in-house activities. I wrote here normally because if, and this is actually a very, very important nuance to remember, if as a part of a company's business model, they outsource some of the routine services, you can include that portion into the in-house portion of the grant. So even if we're talking about virtual companies, that is still okay. You just have to very carefully craft the application and make sure that you're explaining that this is something that you normally do. With the phase 1, with the phase 2, you need to have 50% in-house, but it's more or less the same. And with phase 2 SBRs, you do need a commercialization plan where you talk about the market and how your team understands where they are. So I just wanted to show you some specific SBR and STTR programs. And I've tried to talk about many different types of them. So the first one is with the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, NIAID. This is for radiological or nuclear medical countermeasures product development programs. So that's an SBIR. When we're talking about the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, they have a grant for brain research through advancing innovation Neurotechnologies, they call it the BRAIN Initiative. National Institute of Drug Abuse, Helping to Aid Addiction Long-Term Heal Initiative. The National Institute of Bioimaging and Bioengineering, Exploratory Clinical Trials for Small Businesses. And obviously, the list goes on, but these are just a few examples. I did want to bring you the specific solicitations. So here you see the 4 major parent announcements for the SBRs and STTRs. The first one is for the STTR without a clinical trial. Second one is STTR with a clinical trial. Third one is SBIR without a clinical trial, and an SBR with a clinical trial. I will point out that this division is relatively new as well, and we do see a shift towards the investigator-initiated opportunities for the reasons that I mentioned. So make sure that you don't get lost with the different types of opportunities and submit to the most appropriate solicitation. The next set of grants that I want to talk about are the non-SBIR. So firstly, we have the Parent R21, which is essentially the high risk, high reward type of grant with the NIH. They are considered to be academia focused, but the truth is that they are very happy to have industry collaborations as well. Many of our clients submit and win R21s every year without any type of academic connections at all. The deadlines are February 16th, June 16th, and October 16th. The budget is typically $275,000 plus indirect costs. So unlike the SBIR budget that we discussed before, here on top of the grant itself, they add an additional element for the overhead. I would say that for domestic companies, we're typically talking about 35-40% on top of that. With academic institutes, these rates go way, way higher. But of course, we negotiate these with the NIH as we approach the award itself. The R21 funds exploratory and developmental research projects by providing support to the early and conceptual stages of the project. So here, they don't even want you to have preliminary data. This is very, very early stage work. It's a great stepping stone to the next types of grants. So we definitely see that it is a mechanism that is very helpful to many of our clients that are in the early stage of the R&D work. The second type of grant, that is relevant is the Parent R01. This is for work that is a bit more advanced. The deadlines are February 5th, June 5th, and October 5th. The award is much larger, 2.5 million plus indirect costs. But to be honest, most of the R1s actually don't have a budget cap. You know, the 2.5 million is what they more or less expect to see, but they removed the budget cap to make sure that they do have that flexibility that that we talked about earlier. So just to show you that they are putting in a lot of work to make these grants attractive. The R1 and the R21 solicitations are divided to clinical and non-clinical and human experimental studies with human required or not. Make sure that, of course, you're going after the one that is the best fit for you. And generally speaking, when we look at the NIH review process, we tend to look at it as a scientific review, which of course it is in a way, but we find that a better way to look at it is as a risk assessment process. We need to make sure that we're showing the NIH reviewers that it is definitely a good idea for them to invest in your company, in the project, and pick your team as an awardee. And they have a system of 5 review criteria. the first one, the most important one, is the scientific approach. What will you be doing with the money that they will potentially award you? Will you be doing something that is clear? Did you think it through? Do you know what the potential problems are? How will you solve them? And the more detail you can add, the better. In addition to the scientific approach, we have the significance of the work. Is this a problem that is important to the citizens of the US? Are you trying to solve this problem with innovation? Is this something new? Is this a new method? Is this a new approach? The third one is the leadership. Who is the team who will be seeing this project through? Are they experienced? Do they work together? And of course, is this a real scientific team, or did they just add someone to make sure that the grant looks fancy, but in reality, these are not people who have experience working together? And the last one is environment. Where will you be conducting the actual work? Do you have the sufficient lab space, the equipment? Is everything, of course, ready to support this type of work? And by the way, if you do not have the right environment, you can also say, hey, here's the CRO that we'll use, or here's what we'll need from the lab that we'll probably hire. Okay. The next agency that I want to talk about is BARDA, which is the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. What BARDA does is basically develop and help fund any type of chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear accidents, incidents, and attacks, pandemic influenza, and emerging infectious diseases. Of course, COVID as well. I can tell you that they are absolutely all over this. Wonderful awards, wonderful review process that they actually shortened to make sure that it is still relevant as we actually have the research done. And in a way, the space in which BARDA typically operates is phase 1, phase 2 trials, here to help companies basically overcome the valley of death and make sure that they are able to see the project through. They sometimes even purchase the either biologic or device or tool that you're developing at the end. So not bad at all. And the review process we see with BARDA is a little different compared to what we see with the NIH. And it's actually divided into two. The first part is called the white paper. And it is a very short summary of your planned activities, about 10 pages. You send that over to them, they review, and then only if they're interested, you're invited to submit the full application. I will say that BARDA applications are very long, about 300 pages. So make sure, of course, that you are taking enough time to be able to submit such an application. After the application is submitted, it is reviewed again, and then you go into the negotiation stage, where they come back and typically ask about the budget. If they have some comments on the R&D plan, of course, this is where you come to agreement and hopefully the award. In terms of the main area of interests, so obviously anything vaccine, infectious diseases, diagnostics, influenza, of course, and obviously COVID-19. I will say that there is no budget cap for BARDA. So it is definitely the right place to go if you are in the infectious disease space and you are planning a big trial. Another agency that I want to talk about is the DoD, the Department of Defense. They have a few initiatives, and they also love acronyms. So we'll see plenty of those. The first one is DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. USAMRAC, U.S. Army Medical Research and Material Commands, and DTRA, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. So just as an example, I want to talk about the USAMRAC. In terms of the review process, it is very similar to what we see with BARDA, and this is something that is very common with the DoD. You start with a 2-page summary. It is reviewed. You're hopefully invited to submit the full application, review again, negotiations, and then hopefully award. So in terms of their main interests, they're here to provide solutions to medical problems of importance to the American warfighter: military infectious diseases, combat casualty care, military operational medicine, clinical and rehabilitation medicine, military biological defense, medical chemical defense, and medical simulation and information sciences. Another initiative that is a part of the DoD is the CDMRPs. I promised many acronyms. The Congressionally Directed Medical Research Programs. They come out once a year, and they have a very, very wide scope because they're here to take care of soldiers and warfighters, of course, but also veterans and their family members. So their scope is incredibly wide, and this is the list of topics for 2020. As you can see, it is incredibly diverse. They do a lot of work with neurodegeneration. So you have the ALS program, autism, chronic pain management, breast cancer, lung cancer, lupus, military burn, spinal cord injury, ovarian cancer, and the list definitely goes on and on. And in addition to that, I would like you to take a look at these 2 programs that are actually the titles of 2 programs that have many topics within them. We have the peer-reviewed cancer research program that is actually still open, and we have the peer-reviewed medical research program that has 44 topics. I will say that each one of these indications has a different deadline. So as you can see, I added the eBRAP link below. Make sure that you take a look and go after an application and a program that is still open. So I just wanted to show you some of the peer-reviewed medical topics. This is what we have for 2020. We have arthritis, we have diabetes, we have food allergies, we have Fragile X syndromes, we have hepatitis B, pressure ulcers, and really, sleep disorders, and they are very, very versatile. And I'll also mention that unlike the NIH that is more or less stable, we do see with the CDMRPs that that they target different topics every year. So even if the specific indication that you're looking at is not within the list that I showed here, it doesn't mean anything about next year. And in a way, because these are all directed by Congress, if there is a need of the US citizens to help fight a specific problem, this is a good way for them to do that. And by the way, of course, they have a CDMRP topic as well. A COVID-19 topic as well. That is a great way to fund your COVID-19 project. So when we're talking about strategic sources of funding, obviously, we preach non-dilutive funding, but we do know that it's just one piece of the puzzle. Of course, IPOs, go after equity investors, angels, VCs, absolutely. What we're here to say is that this is a huge pool of money that is very relevant in terms of obtaining the grants themselves. It's actually cheaper than going after the private sector, both in terms of time from actually starting the process to having money in your hand, and of course the amount of time that you have to invest into the process as well. So don't forget about non-dilutive grants. I will say in terms of maximizing your chances of award, it's all about lowering the risk for the funding agencies and of course for yourself. So before you start, we do recommend seeking insight into the goals of the funding agencies. But as you do that, make sure that you are still within what you want to do. There is no logic in going after a specific grant if it will not fund the actual work you would like to complete. If you have the long-term R&D plan and this grant is not a good fit, there's really no need to go after it. You have to know your weaknesses and find partners if necessary. Making sure that you talk about the potential pitfalls is not a bad thing, because if you'll think about the people reviewing these grants, they are the top experts in your field, and they'll be able to pick up on any potential problems. So the fact that you are aware and that you are addressing it is nothing but good to the application. And partners are not always necessary. We do hear quite a bit about companies that think that they need an academic collaborator or a big pharma to be able to submit these grants. If you have everything in-house, there's no need to go after additional collaborations. But if you are planning a project on Alzheimer's and you don't have an Alzheimer's expert in your team, obviously it makes sense to make sure that you have someone on board that could be helpful in that. We do recommend identifying all of the relevant funding opportunities before you actually start, to make sure that you're prioritizing correctly, and really doing your homework helps you not waste your time after you've started. And of course, plan and execute a long-term multi-submission granting strategy. The reason that this is definitely the most important thing I have to say is that, and I don't know how many of you went after these grants, but this is, these grants are not easy to win. It takes a minute. It's not always okay first time around. And, if you look at the pay lines and the success rates across the board, obviously it's never 100%, but the way to beat the system in a way is to be very systematic and submit as many as possible, and have as many shots on goal as you can. Let's just say that you have a wonderful oncology project that is relevant to the NIH and the DoD, submit to both. They are definitely okay with this, and that is how you increase your chances, because again, you can never know. So what we typically do is with the companies that we work with is firstly start by identifying everything you can, even things that are just somewhat relevant, to make sure that you're starting with a list that has everything, and then you can start prioritizing from there. We create a multi-submission granting strategy to make sure that we're tapping into all of the sources of funding that we found, and of course, submit as many grants as possible. At FreeMind, I will say that most of what we do is definitely submit grants, but we also have a strategic network of big pharma investors who invest in our clients, and we do some investing in-house as well. Mostly because, as I mentioned, companies who go through the process have a very good chance of being around, of being successful, because these are the most experienced people who will be taking a look at what you do. This is the most rigorous review process in the entire world. So going through it does nothing but good things to the company and the team. So that's what I had. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Let's see. And if you don't, I'll just assume that I was very clear. I'm kidding. If any additional questions arise after we're done here, please feel free to send me an email. You can also find a lot of information within our YouTube channel, our LinkedIn, and our Twitter account. So thank you all for your time, and have a great day. Keep safe.